welcome and everybody who's going to see the replay later on. And ladies and gentlemen, this session is going to be about how are we actually getting change going? How are we making this transition work that we need to make it work? And we have a grand lineup of participants, of panelists. But first of all, ladies and gentlemen, we have the man who is at the helm of getting this climate transition going in the EU. And I say hello to Frans Timmermans, the Executive Vice President of the European Commission. I mean, first of all, thank you very much, sir, for taking the time. I know your time is short, so let's make most of it. And I think these days we cannot talk about anything without mentioning the war and the Russian invasion in Ukraine with all its spillover effects. And I think even the last person on the street in Europe now knows that we do have supply chains and that everything actually belongs together. Now, the question is, in how far is the Green Deal, is the Fit for 55 program influenced by the changes due to the war, i.e. increased energy prices, changing supply chains of food? So, sir, take it away.
Well, first of all, I believe that we now understand, as you say, you're absolutely right in saying that every single European now understands our dependence on fossil fuels. And everybody understands that we need to be less dependent on outside providers of fossil fuels. Since we don't produce our fossil fuels ourselves, we need to look especially at alternatives. And the three main alternatives, in my view, are solar power, offshore wind energy, and biogases. And if we speed up our transition to those sources of fuel, first of all, we can reduce our energy bills. And secondly, we can send a clear signal to Mr. Putin that he is not able to blackmail us with his energy. I believe that in COVID, we had the same reaction first. Is the Green Deal still relevant now that we have the COVID pandemic? And then we understood that the green transformation was also an answer to the risks of a pandemic and the economic negative effects of the pandemic. Likewise, the energy transition is also an answer to the geopolitical challenge, which is our dependence on Russian fossil fuels.
Yeah, we had an earlier discussion today that also included circular economy as one of the means by which to speed up the process. Now, let's look at the transformation and at everybody who needs to carry it. You do have the buy-in of diverse governments, of course. You do have the buy-ins of politicians, of course, with some criticism. You have companies actually saying this is the right way to go. There's always this question mark. How do you actually take along the person in the street? How do you make it understood? How do you take them along and not have a Gilets jaunes movement all across Europe?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be very much aware of the fact that, like you said before, about everybody now being aware of the supply chains. I think most, if not all of our citizens are very much aware about the danger of the climate crisis we're in. Everybody understands that we need to do something. And I also believe that citizens are now also discovering their own power in all of this. You know, if people who can do it reduce the temperature in their houses by 1 degree only, it reduces our consumption of Russian energy or of natural gas by 10 BCM. It's an enormous 10 billion cubic meters of gas less, just 1 degree lower temperature in our houses. So this shows that the collective power of our citizens is huge in all of this. And that even by taking small steps, but if you prolong them over a long period of time, this transformation can be done. But the most important issue here is by using less energy, by being more energy efficient, by moving to renewable energy, you also, not just punish Putin, but you also reduce your monthly energy bill. And I think this is a huge incentive people understand. And you contribute to reducing our emissions and helping our climate. So it's a win-win-win-win situation. And I believe most of our citizens understand this, but many citizens are afraid they will be left behind, that they can't afford that. They can't afford the solar panels. They can't afford an electric car. And we have to prove to them that it is affordable, that it is feasible. The 20% richest households in Europe are responsible for 32% of road transport and building emissions. And the 20% poorest households are only responsible for 9% of these emissions. So the poorest households should be helped, whereas the richer households should be asked to contribute more to our emission reductions. I think that's a fair deal. If we explain it clearly, then I think we can convince people to be part of it. The core issue here is this transition going to be fair and seen as fair by our citizens? If we can pull that off, if we can prove that, I think we will have massive support.
I've just come out of a session that was particularly concerned about carbon pricing and the fairness of it. One of the takeaways of diverse studies was that you have to make it fair and transparent. So what does the Commission do to make it transparent, i.e. actually really take the fear away from those households that say, oh gosh, we can't afford it, and actually taking them along, making them proactive, making them ambassadors of the policies?
Well, what we've done in industry, as you know, is we've for over many years already have a functioning emissions trading system. Direct carbon pricing, we put it into a market instrument, which is the emissions trading system. And it has helped us in industry tremendously. Over the last, since 1990, we have reduced our emissions by about a quarter. Whereas our economy has grown with over 60%. So we have decoupled the increase of emissions from economic growth. And now we need to do the same in households. We need to decouple the reduction of emissions from the cost that is incurred by our citizens. We believe that a dedicated emissions trading system for transport and buildings can help, but only if before introducing it, you would have in place a social climate fund that would help people to avoid the risk of energy poverty. So let's have the social climate fund functioning before we introduce a dedicated ETS system in transport and in buildings. And this system is, I think, transparent because it puts the onus on the ones who deliver the energy. And I think preliminary experiences in Germany with an ETS on road transport show that the effect at the pump is very limited, but the effect in behavioral changes by the producers of the energy is considerable.
Thank you very much for that. Now, our current policy answers to a climate crisis are tweaks. We sort of turn a lot of points, but it does not seem to be sort of one big throw, apart, of course, from Fit for 55 and all of that. Let's look at ETS. Still, emissions have been rising. Only a tiny fraction of emissions is actually captured by ETS. So how do we get away from this silo thinking and embrace more?
Yeah, I think we should not short sell what we've already achieved. The ETS was introduced in 2005. Frankly, most people didn't believe in it in the first years. But in the sectors that are now covered by ETS, we've reduced emissions with about 43%. That's a huge success. So what we want to do now, that's a proposal of the Commission, is to introduce a new target to reduce emissions from the ETS sectors by 61% by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. That would be an increase of 18 percent points compared to the target under the existing legislation. But it's, as you say, it's not the only tool we could use. We need to have a systemic transformation, a tectonic systemic transformation. And I think we should stick to the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package, because the Fit for 55 package gives you this transformation in only 8 years that we need to reduce our emissions with at least 55% by 2030 and reach climate neutrality by 2050. I hope we can get a common position of the Parliament on this Fit for 55 package before the summer. I also hope the Council can, even in this very complicated situation with Ukraine, the Council can still move ahead with this. Because if we make the choice of this transformation, it will certainly strengthen our resilience in a world that will challenge Europe in an incredible way in the time to come. So I hope that if we can manage this transformation by combining all these tools to an intelligent policy mix, regulatory instruments, taxation, emissions trading, we can do all of that in the Fit for 55 package. We can achieve the transformation you were talking about. And of course, it is never going to be a revolution in a week. The 8 years, I mean, that's tomorrow. Just think back 8 years. It was like yesterday. So these 8 years we have now to reach this reduction are going to be very transformative years. And I hope we can convince industry, but especially our citizens, that they have to be part of this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Timmermans. I know that you've got to run in 4 minutes, but I'm still going to use those 4 minutes. So first of all, I'd like to share with you that when you used the word decoupling, I think Dennis Noah's heart went out and bubbled more fast than it has done today, because that's one of the words that has been associated with the Global Solutions Summit for a number of years. The second point is it's 5.5 years roundaboutish that we still have until we want to be not just fit for 55, we want to have achieved the 55. And some of the issues that we are covering, both on the policy front and also on the actual doing front, seem to be like operating on an open heart, simply because it hasn't been done before like this and it hasn't been done in this speed. How optimistic are you for the next couple of years that we're actually on the right pathway?
Well, it all depends on whether we have a collective sense of urgency. If we have a collective sense of urgency, we can move mountains. We saw it with the pandemic. How quickly did Europe not develop the best vaccines in the world? It was in Europe that these were developed at lightning speed. People said it takes a decade for a vaccine, or at least 5 years. Look how if Europeans understand the urgency of the climate crisis, they will come together and take the necessary measures in the pace that we need. We can really do this. The one thing I worry most about is that we fail to see that this is essentially an issue of social justice. This is essentially a core issue of politics about distribution and redistribution. If you think about politics, in essence, politics is only about one thing, and that's redistribution. And that doesn't matter whether it's left wing or right wing, it's always about redistribution. Giving tax relief to the richest people is redistribution, just as much as imposing higher taxes on rich people is redistribution. And we need to get this redistribution question right in a completely new context. We need, as humanity, to learn to live within planetary boundaries. And if we as Europeans can be successful in transforming our economy and society in a way that shows that we're able to live within planetary boundaries, we will have followers around the world who would like to copy our model. This is a huge opportunity for us, morally, socially, but also economically. And we need to seize this opportunity. We cannot face our children and grandchildren, in all honesty, if we don't do it now.
We all wish that you keep up your realistic optimism, Mr. Timmermans. Thank you very much to Brussels. We know you've got to run. Thank you very much for having been with us here at the Global Solutions Summit 2022. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, in a big thank you. I hope that you can still get the applause. I'd like to sit down and I'd like to welcome a wonderful, wonderful panel. And I think I've mentioned him before, so let me quickly get the gentleman to come and join us here on stage in the middle, and that's Dennis Noah. And if I read all your wonderful attributes, Dennis, then I think we'd be here till tomorrow. So just the Global Solutions Initiative founder, German-American or American-German economist, blah, blah, blah. But there's one word, and that's caring economics. And I think I would like to pick up on that. Also here in the room is a wonderful lady, and I'd like her to join us up here on stage. And she is Petra Justenhofen, at the moment assurance leader at PwC Germany and Europe, incoming head here in Germany, and we're really happy that you're here because we were talking about the different stakeholders that we need in order to get this transformation going. And of course, cooperation and corporate thinking is one really important bit. And now I do hope, there she is, Mafalda Duarte, CEO of Climate Investment Funds, normally in Washington. I'm not quite sure where you are right at the moment. She's traveling most of the time, so we are lucky to catch her, probably not on a plane, but otherwise we never know where she is. Just recently been in London with the Financial Times. She talks about everything from climate action to climate finance, and finance is, of course, the one aspect that we're going to be talking about with you. And last but not least, also a global citizen. And I see Rockström is connecting, so you're going to see the face in a moment as he has connected, but seeing that I'm in the introductory round, I'm going to say co-director at the PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and we've just heard Mr. Timmermans talk about the global boundaries, and of course Johan was one of the founders of the concept of the global boundaries, of which climate change is only one aspect. There are actually two that are worse off, and I still see connecting. We'll see his face in a second, and maybe just sort of to name names, Johan has also been working together with David Attenborough, who our ambassador, the global ambassador on breaking boundaries. Now, Dennis, let's kick off with you, because you actually put this session together. So, and I know that from last couple of years, your heart is very much in it. How do we get this transition? Why are you worried that maybe we are not on the right way? So how can we harmonize everybody that is already chipping in? And the last question I have, and I think we should, are we just in a bubble? Like here at the Global Solutions Summit, fantastic people, everybody forward thinking, but what about the man and the woman on the street? Okay, you've got 3 minutes.
I think you've answered your own question, which is that we would make more progress on climate action if this climate action were more socially acceptable. Now, we have heard inspiring things from Frans Timmermans, and in fact, the European Union is ahead of the game in this respect. But if we look worldwide, we see that there are 61 countries and regions that are subject to some form of carbon pricing. Of those, approximately, the World Bank has estimated 4% are subject to carbon pricing that is consistent with the Paris Climate Accord. And if we take into account that 1/5 of all global emissions is subject to any carbon price, then we conclude that 0.8% of global emissions are subject to an effective carbon price. That's after 30 years of trying. So what has gone wrong? And I think there are many answers, but there are two really important ones. One is we have very well-funded lobbying efforts that pull in the opposite direction. And the other, which is even more important, is that although most people are in favor of climate action, people do not like to pay for it in terms of carbon taxes for reasons that are understandable. That if you work in a carbon-intensive sector, then your job may be on the line. If you're poor, then your foodstuffs go up in price. And therefore, and that is what motivated the heartache that gave rise to this session, we need to make sure that our climate action proposals are socially acceptable. And what social acceptability means will differ in different countries and different cultures. And therefore, we should not start thinking about climate policies that do not have this social acceptability aspect as part of them. And once we've put the social acceptability part in, then we must accept the fact that countries at different stages of development with different cultures will find different pathways to the ultimate goal.
Thank you very much. And let me just recognize that Johanna Rockström is with us. Johanna, I've already sort of introduced you with many, many words, so I'm not going to repeat that right now. But I'll just give you a moment to breathe and really be with us. So maybe, Petra, let's turn to one of the stakeholder areas. And when I talked about corporates, we know all over the world we have alliances, we have associations, we have big companies actually rubbing shoulders and saying, yes, we need to do something about fighting climate change. We need to prove that we do climate action. In how far is PwC involved? I've just had your colleague from the English side, your climate envoy, and sort of you seem to be initiating, incorporating in studies yourself. But then how do you actually go out and talk to your customers, other companies?
So we are doing that in many ways, and maybe stating first, this is close to our hearts. So we see companies during these years transitioning, and there's this urgency. We've just heard from Frans Timmermans, having been pushed by COVID, having been pushed now by the war. So we're accompanying companies from sort of starting with their strategy all over through the operations until the reporting and even auditing the data they are going to make transparent for supporting the whole transition. So it's all the value chain, and we're sort of helping clients wherever they find themselves looking for support. So it might be, at the beginning of that value chain, or it might be at some sort of in-between. But what we're seeing right now is that there is a sentiment of this urgency and a high recognition of customers, of stakeholders, and of regulators pushing companies in that direction. But at the same time, the recognition this is a win-win. If we take that at the heart of the strategy, it is sort of leveraging the business model and bringing it to the next level. So that's a movement we're seeing since the last few years, and I think that's the dynamic which has taken up. I mean, there are hurdles on the way, and I guess we're talking about them later on. But that's the positive side.
Thank you so much. And Mafalda, if you allow me to bring Johan into the conversation before you, because of course we need money, so that's your role, of course. How do we get it, and how can we apply it best? Johan, you have sort of two hats. One hand, of course, the serious scientist. On the other hand, the one who sort of puts out the message. We need to move, and we need to move fast. In how far do you see that message is getting to people in a different way today than 10 years ago? In how far are people appreciative of the facts that scientists put out there? And do you actually see that the move to action has already happened?
Yeah, thanks. No, I think I would like to follow on Petra's reflections here to answer your question. That I think we definitely see a very significant trend line over just the past 5 years of a rising level of, you could call it urgency, I would call it sense of discomfort. There is this growing sense that things are not, responding in the Earth system as we had expected. You have a higher frequency and more severe droughts, heat waves, disease patterns, uncomfortable surprises such as what we now see in East Antarctica with a 40 degrees Celsius sudden abrupt deviation hitting us in a way that is starting to, really give reflections, for example, at the Munich Security Conference, where climate change, despite just stepping right into this terrible war, was still at the highest security level. The World Economic Forum showing the same thing. So I think Frans Timmermans is right that if we talk about security, peace, and having an outcome for a more prosperous and equitable future, climate change, the ecological crisis, has now, so to say, eaten itself deeper into the, let's say, the deep fabric of consciousness in policymaking, in business, in a way that we haven't seen before. So the challenge comes back to Dennis' point. How do we now have not only a safe landing, but a soft landing, a landing that is also socially manageable, so we don't create even more disruption in the future? And let me just close by saying that let's not make the mistake of considering our inability to act on the climate crisis in the financial crisis in 2008, because we just rebound back to the old business as usual. Our inability so far to use the COVID crisis as a way of really accelerating the transition towards a more resilient future. Let's not do the mistake of seeing also the war now in Ukraine as the same kind of business as usual rebound, because just like Frans points out, I really support that now is the moment we see that moving away from dependence on gas and oil and coal is a pathway not only to, so to say, save the planet, but it's also a way of enabling a pathway towards a more secure and peaceful future. So now is the moment, this is the crisis to really accelerate the pathway towards a safe landing.
Thank you very much for that. And I'd like to bring Mafalda in at this point. Of course, everything needs to be financed, but there is a hell of a lot of money out there. It's just got to be sort of put into the right pots, and it's got to be redirected. Also, we've had COP26 with a breakthrough development. Finally, finance was as a big topic on the table, and we're gearing up now to COP27. So what is the role of finance? Are we getting there? Are we greening finance? Or is it just like green bonds, sexy to be had, but just 4% of everything that's available?
Thank you, Connie, and thank you very much for inviting us to be here. It's a pleasure to be with you and Dennis and Petra and Johan. We have made some progress. We have a long way to go. This is the short answer. It is right to say that COP26, we had more private sector representation and more private capital in the room. There were some announcements and statements made of alignment to net zero. Now the question will be, how does one translate that into concrete investments that align with the climate goals? And that's the work that is ahead. And the other thing that is important to bear in mind, I carry a message of concern vis-a-vis what's happening in developing countries, because developing countries are bearing the brunt of the climate impacts, and also have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and now will suffer the consequences of this war in Ukraine as well. We have been seeing, even before this even before the pandemic, really, and before the war in Ukraine, that the bulk. So just a metric here, 15% of the total investments, global investments in renewable energy from 2013 to 2018 happened in developed countries. And we had actually seen a worrying trend of decreased levels of investment in clean energy in developing countries. Why is this so important? It's important from many points of view, but certainly because one has to realize that most of the population in the world is living in middle-income countries. And therefore, these are the countries, middle-income countries and low-income countries, are the countries that are going to face the highest population growth. These are the countries that will run on most of the energy supply, 70% of global energy supply, 60% of GDP. This is where the biggest investment gaps are in terms of infrastructure. And therefore, we are faced with a situation right now where these are the countries where the bulk of the investments need to happen. They need to be aligned with net zero, with climate goals. But those flows of investment are basically mostly kept in developed countries, and therefore it was important. So I circled back to COP in Glasgow. It was very important to have the private sector in the room, the corporates, the financial sector. It is very important to get them to make commitments. But in addition to all of this, we now need to work to make sure that they translate that into actual investments and investments in developing countries. So the role of public capital, more so even than in the past, in the future, needs to be how do we use this public capital that is scarce very judiciously to really enable private capital investments at a much larger scale and align with the climate goals in developing countries. This is a very critical point in relation to finance.
Thank you so much. Even though one has seen, especially last year, quite a number or quite a bit of progress in that green taxonomies have been set up all around the globe. We have China chipping in, actually adopting the European model. Dennis, I look at your face and normally it smiles. Right at the moment you look still worried. Of course, with hindsight and with looking at what has happened in the past, it doesn't seem to be fast enough. We see a number of new topics. We've heard Timmermans saying it's a win-win-win situation. We do not have to put our head under the blanket and say it's all bad. So let's look at it from a positive way. How can we overcome the silo thinking that you think is holding us back?
I think when we look at what we have done relative to what has happened 10 years ago, we have clearly made progress. We've become more energy efficient. We're more conscious of the climate. If we look at the size of the challenge, then I think we should be super depressed because the Earth system is becoming destabilized in front of our own eyes. And what we are doing is clearly not enough. Mm-hmm. Most of the destabilization comes from developed countries. And the one question that I would like to pose within the developed country framework is, how come do we find that climate action is something that needs to be provided, incentivized through carbon pricing schemes? Why is it not a moral imperative? So, for example, if it were child labor or slavery, would we say, okay, well, we really don't like that, let's tax it. And if you're willing to pay the tax, hell with it, let's do it. No, we say it's just totally unacceptable. Now, is it acceptable for us to destabilize the natural world? Shouldn't we be, in the developed world, moving towards a system where we replace the emissions trading system by fines that indicate that there's something wrong here? And the second thing, and then I'll be shut up, is with regard to the developing countries, they clearly have a huge need for technology transfer, carbon offsets, a social climate fund internationally to help them deal with this is becoming an imperative. Why can we not think more ambitiously with regard to enabling the developing countries to come into the stage where the developed countries should be now and make it a moral imperative?
I hear everything that you say. I see Johan wanting to say something, and I've seen Mafalda nodding a couple of times, and maybe then we bring Petra in. But let's start off with Johan with an attempt of an answer.
Yes, well, I mean, scientifically, we are today at a point where we can, without hesitating and unequivocally give support to Dennis' statement. I mean, we've come to a situation where the ultimate definition of human rights is to hand over to our children a planet which is equally livable as the planet where we, the adult generation which are in charge today, were born. And we've never had to make that statement before. But now we have to do it because we are at risk of destabilizing the life support systems on Earth and pushing the Earth system on a drift away from livable conditions. That's the point we've come to. That's the urgency point. And it, of course, makes us very uncomfortable in the scientific community when we're only talking about nudging and incremental policy measures that do not really address heads-on these fundamentals. And Frans Timmermans made twice the reference to the planetary boundary framework, which is an attempt to do exactly that, to set non-negotiable scientific boundaries within which we can have an equitable, prosperous development of all societies, all economies, all nations, but you have to respect the fence. You have to respect the safe boundaries. And I think that this is, in my mind, the combination. The trick is to have planetary boundaries plus economic market-based incentives like a price on carbon, like incentive schemes, definitely. But you have to play within the playing field. You cannot go outside of the safe arena. And to me, that is not imposing something top-down which excludes a social safe distribution or some kind of equitable distribution. On the contrary, if you have non-negotiable boundaries, you have a budget and it's absolute and you have to share it in a fair way. I think this is where the voice of the South can come in much more strongly.
Yeah, if everybody consumed the way that we do in Germany, we would need 3 Earths per year to use up the raw material and the energy that we are actually using right at the moment. So I've seen Mafalda nod a couple of times, so please chip in.
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree with Dennis and Johan. What we have seen with the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, and Frans Timmermans was mentioning it as well, we have seen the leaders in North America and Europe respond pretty quickly. And they have shown levels of ambition and in a rapid way, like we hadn't necessarily seen in the most recent history. And we are in the run-up to COP27. The issues of solidarity towards middle-income and low-income countries is going to be one of the top issues of discussion. And the question of what is preventing the leaders in North America and Europe or in the developed world to show a much more significant level of ambition towards supporting these countries? If we really understand that there is no climate solution, there is no meeting climate goals unless we support the middle-income countries and low-income countries join us in that pathway, and they do need the support. And so this is why I was nodding. Of course, as I said earlier on, we need a much higher level of ambition, of solidarity, and be conscious about how we use this financial support so that it can really unlock private sector investments and tackle structural inequalities. This is an opportunity in time in history of tackling inequalities that haven't been tackled in previous crises as well. Because I agree with all of the speakers that unless if we put social justice and just transition at the core, at the heart of these transitions and transformations that are asked for, we will not make it. But I think it's important that we make people understand in Europe and North America that we need to bring everybody alongside. that unless if we also focus, North America and Europe and other developed countries need to show a lot of leadership domestically and in within their own countries and regions. But unless if we also focus in the global south, we will not make it. And in not making it means everybody not making it.
Thank you very much, Mafalda. I'd like to turn to Petra. We've seen that big companies certainly have assumed a new role, that of the global citizen, and therefore also assume a new responsibility, something that Mafalda was actually addressing. Do big companies like yours or like the customers that you work with wait for the right policy design, or are you acting or trying to act more proactively in the sense of addressing all the issues that are out there, climate change, loss of biodiversity, etc.?
So, and thanks for the question, because I think it's at the heart of what's going on right now and the whole transition. So I think we are in a stadium where it comes together, where policymakers, companies, societies, they all come together and figure out what is really working. So when I'm discussing with management of companies, I think they got it. They see the need for the transition. If they are looking at policymaking, I think it's super important that policymaking creates trust. Because what we are doing is longer term. There is need for speed, but we are doing a longer term exercise. So there needs to be trust in the system going into the right direction. We've seen some, ad hoc decisions within policymaking, which is not bringing that trust into the system. So I think that has to be avoided. Governments, they have also a role themselves, because they are buyers, customers themselves. If you look at the transportation systems, for example, at their own sort of people, so they can be and should be a role model themselves. I think that also gives trust in the system. Also on this, the social aspects, they are employers themselves, and they should take on board whatever we are discussing on the social economic aspect. And then there are 2-3 technical things. Large industries, they need to do big investments, and technologies are not clear yet. So I think there is something where policymakers, governance, financial system can support in terms of the first financing, taking the risks, unless it's really clear, what technologies are going to work. Yeah. So I think that's critical and crucial.
Thank you so much. Of course, we've had a lot of attention to the so-called hard-to-abate industries, but there we're making progress as well. I know that everybody out there is going to kill me, but I'm going to overrun, and I'm going to state it now, because one of or two of our youngsters, of our young global leaders, do have a question. Could I please ask you, if you want to speak both, to be really brief in your questions, so that we can actually answer them? Microphone, quickly.
Thank you so much. My name is Gina Cortez Valderrama. I'm from Colombia, and I'm the Young Global Changer Ambassador for Latin America. And I would like to bring back a point that I put in the last session, and it's in terms of responsibility, and I think also coming back to the points of trust and also social justice that we were discussing before. So in the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, there is really clear stated the common but differentiated responsibilities of developed countries towards the different climate impacts in developing countries. So how we can speak about the responsibility of these destructive and neo-colonial practices that have been implemented in our territories that are exacerbating different inequalities. And when we think about trust and development from the countries, there is a lack of coherence. If you go back to COP26, developed countries limited the creation of a financial mechanism for loss and damage, for damages on people that have experienced permanent damages in their culture and identities. And they have not been able to commit on that. So how we can then build up this trust and these commitments on that?
I love the question, and it wasn't a short one, so sorry about that. So maybe could we just sort of a hand movement? Anybody who wants to chip in from our panelists to quickly answer? Johan, always a safe haven.
But just very fast. I mean, Dina, this is a brilliant question. It connects very much to Dennis' reflections earlier about the responsibility from the global north. I would like to advise, though, that we are beyond common and differentiated responsibilities in the sense that the whole world now must reach a net zero, prosperous and safe future. Everyone will win by it. I really support scientifically Frans Timmermans that net zero, fossil fuel free development will give us much, much better jobs, economies, safety, health. So you don't want to lag, you don't want to miss out on that next development for humanity in the future. So it comes down to money. It comes down to the loss and damage agenda. It comes down to investment schemes. It comes down to supporting the developing countries to be able to really, really move in this transition. I think that's where the effort should be put, not in defending the rights to move slowly.
Thank you so much for that answer. I take Mafalda's nodding as a yes. I know that you could give a long answer to that. Thank you very much for having taken the time. Petra, thank you very much for sharing sort of the corporate view on the issues. And Dennis, as always, the sessions are just much too short. This is a complaint, an official one, because I think each and every one could have talked a bit more. But thank you so much. Also for sharing your worries, and it's lovely that you think that we actually need to speed up our action. Thank you very much, our global changers. You have the future in your hands, and I hope that we can actually put a livable globe into your hands and to that of your children. This could not answer everything. My aspiration is always that we come to a conclusion and that we have sort of the ultimate answer. I think this is a question that we will continue to discuss. We need everybody to chip in, and I hope that we're going to have this big on the screen at the next Global Solutions 2023. Thank you very much, Dennis, Petra, for having been there, Mafalda, Johan, for joining us, and everybody who is actually here in this room. And I now think we have to leave very quickly because the others are going to push off stage. Thank you very much.